So a feature of this book, especially in the early chapters, is the semi-autobiographical content. Your encounters not only with the revolutionary left, but the gay rights movement, the snobbery that you found on the left, the sophistication of individual capitalists and managers when you were a young worker. Some of these encounters will be immediately recognisable to any person joining the left or going into work. But for all the snobbery and the excusing of tyranny and the distance sometimes from the realities of daily life, would it be fair to say that this world, the Young Communist League, the International Socialists, the Gay Liberation Front, is the world that has shaped you politically and culturally, even to today?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the reason for the biographical thing is I make a point somewhere in the text of the book, an amusing point, pointing out that the YCL was like my grammar school in the sense that I learned lots of things because I left school at 15, went to full-time work, so my education was cut off at the knees, so to speak. And working with being a member of the Young Communist League meant that I learned about Bessie Smith, about different kinds of music, different kinds of theatre. I discovered who Sisyphus was and Prometheus and all sorts of things that I might well have learned in a grammar school. But it also amused me in the sense of thinking that my struggle, being in the Young Communist League, is what led me on the route to becoming middle class. And spending a great deal of effort in trying to leave the working class behind. And I suspect this is a common experience even today. I see that the voluntary sector is stuffed full of young people who are trying to make their way in the world, trying to get better jobs and getting promoted to be managers or whatever it is. And this is perfectly understandable, really. And it describes how trapped we are within the capitalist reality, the real circumstances. So that on the one hand, we wanted to argue, when I was a kid, 15 or 16, argue in the interests of the working class, and at the same time, with correspondence courses and night classes and all the rest of it, I was doing everything I could to leave the working class, right? And I think that that tension, that conflict, was very lively in my life as a youngster in the 60s, as was the conflict over being homosexual, being deeply closeted, and being in a movement that was, shall we say, not progressive about homosexuality in any sense whatsoever, right? And so, yeah, so I think the personal experiences are important, and also they're important in time to reveal the nature of change, right? Because it's extremely difficult for a young person to believe that I worked in an office block where I wasn't allowed to use the lift because I was a clerk and not somebody more superior, right? Most young people would think, what? They would think that was completely mad. But that was the world that I grew up in. I grew up in a very different kind of set of circumstances from contemporary experience. And I think that the reason I talk about it as personal experiences is because the mass of working people are constantly subject to these extraordinary changes. I mean, so that working people now live and work in entirely different circumstances, and how they live, how they work, all the rest of it. I mean, the degree to which they phone up Deliveroo and get food, or they get food on the hoof, or what, all of these things were unimaginable when I was growing up.
And no one needs to phone them up anymore. You just need to click a button.
That's right, yeah. So none of this existed. I mean, you went to the chip shop at night, that was it. But, so the whole circumstances in which people live the whole way in which they live, and the attitudes that the cultural and social attitudes that form them, are constantly being altered by capital, by the technology, by the way we work, and so on. So that's really the reason for the biographical interventions in the text of the book, because I wanted to make it clear that my confusions about capitalism grow out of my real life and continue to be confused about it.
And I think many will see the book as a long goodbye letter to the left and to the revolutionary cause. You write quite at length of the failures and the disasters, the crimes done under the red flag. Is there anything that can be rescued from all of that?
Well, I don't think that anything can be rescued from it if people do not understand that emancipation and liberation cannot be resolved by dictatorship, right? As long as people hang on to Bolshevism and those terrible dictators, Lenin and Trotsky. We're supposed to think that Trotsky was better than Stalin. There's no evidence to suggest that. Trotsky was just as much a murdering bastard as Stalin, right? He just fell out in the struggle in Russia. He came off the wrong side. So, yeah, I mean, the struggle for liberation and being free and being not alienated, I think it's a real impulse. So the left-wing or radical impulse is alive and well, and is not going to be crushed. That's why the leader of the Chinese dictatorship recently addressed, when he addressed the United Nations, said that democracy was a right to be cherished by everybody. Now, what he meant by this, God only knows, but I mean, it's worth digging him out and listening to the 15-minute speech he made to the United Nations about democracy. And you'd think you're living in a madhouse, because obviously what he means democracy is, and what I think democracy is, entirely two different things. And then I reflect back that the East German dictatorship was called the German Democratic Republic. And the whole tradition, the Stalinist and communist tradition, is to suggest that their dictatorships are democratic. It's a wonderful oxymoron, the democratic dictatorship. But I don't think that the mass of working people in a country like Britain or in the richer countries of the West are going to buy this at all.
No. No, and you rightly do condemn in your book many of those on the left that do look the other way when it comes to China, Iran, Russia, or the former party dictatorships in the East, the Soviet Union and what have you. Yeah, I think some could say that there is a similar train of thought at play by defending the achievements of the bourgeoisie, which have unevenly endowed freedoms after a long path of tyranny and bloodshed. And you could even say theft, are the defenders of capitalism, of commercial society, and official communism, and what have you, not at the same game when it comes to defending the crimes of the past or the present with the end goals. I think an example, a contemporary example, would be those that defend Europe and what is happening now with Fortress Europe, in terms of is that a price worth paying for stable accumulation and stable societies?
No, I mean, but you're sliding over a number of different things there. It seems to me that the difference between the development of bourgeois democracy and bourgeois democratic states is that they grew rather organically in the course of a couple of centuries, and they were prefaced by the establishment of the rule of law, whereas the communist dictatorships are party policy dictatorships. They're party states, and that they develop a political police. I mean, Lenin and his comrades in December 1917, set up the Cheka, the political police that had the right to shoot anybody without due process and to do what he liked. I mean, so from day one, they were tyrants. Now, if you think of the emergence of the modern capitalist class gradually emerging through the course of the 18th century, out of all kinds of previous arrangements and setups and so on, and their particular crimes, which is chattel slavery and transportation of criminals to Australia and so on. I mean, it is amazing when you think that they set off the first fleet, they set off the 20-odd ships and said, right, you could go to Australia. They didn't quite know where it was entirely. They hadn't really mapped it properly. And when they got there, they went to Botany Bay, and then they moved down the coast before they discovered by accident, what's now Sydney Harbour. But that's what they did. So they sent all these conflicts off in these ships. And why did they do that? They did that because they were unable to send convicts to America because of the American Revolution and Britain's loss of the American colony. So the crimes embedded in capitalist relations are manifold, but they're not equivalent to Stalinist tyranny, because Stalinist tyranny says you've got to put up with all this misery for a better tomorrow. It's a program. It's a program, whereas the bourgeoisie just think, they find themselves in the Caribbean or somewhere and they think we've got no labour, we've got to get labour from somewhere, and they go and steal Africans, right, and enslave them. So they're constantly moving from one thing to another and creating situations and then dealing with the situations as they arise. And consequently, they begin to move towards a bourgeois democratic setup, which they realise is the only reliable way of ruling an industrialised society with big cities, because they couldn't. You see, I mean, order was maintained in the past, in the rural past, by the squire, the landlord, the local magistrate, and the farmers. Mm-hmm. They could maintain order, right, and rule the roost. Well, that broke down once you had big cities with maybe, I mean, not big as far as we're concerned nowadays, but maybe a town with 30 or 40,000 people in it couldn't be controlled in the same way. And that's why they had all these disasters with militia, drunken militia, like the Manchester massacre in 1819, because there was disorder and they couldn't cope with it. They didn't know how to police such a big crowd and so on, and it got them constantly in trouble.
It became a barrier to accumulation, stable accumulation.
It became a barrier to the whole management of the society, and and also not just accumulation, but remember the capitalists want to sleep safely in their beds. Yeah, I think that's much more lively interest.
Yeah, there is the story of Wellington fearing the mob outside of his window and not.
Well, they smashed all his windows.
Yeah.
At number 1 London.
Yeah,
that's right. Wellesley House, whatever it's called. But yes, so the emergence of bourgeois democracy emerges out of the real relations of capitalist society. It's not something imposed upon the society by a dictatorship. It isn't imposed upon it. And that's the interesting thing.
And it also doesn't come from the good hearts of the bourgeoisie as well, does it? It may come from good sense. It
comes from a mixture of things. One, it comes from good hearts. It comes from religious sentiment. It comes from We better do this, otherwise we can't sleep safely in our beds.
Yeah.
We better do this because the cholera will get us. If it gets in the poor, it will come up the street and get us too in our posh square. You know, there's not much difference between Park Square in Leeds and the Market Street further down the Hedgerow in Leeds. It's a very short distance. But when cholera breaks out there in 1830-31, the people in Park Square must have been in a panic.
Yeah.
And consequently, dealing with sewage and all of these matters are important to them. So I wouldn't say that the capitalists think, ha, we better do this in order to save our bacon. I think that it's a complex series of things. That's why you could have journalists, novelists, scientists, do-gooders, a whole range, a whole panoply of people who are engaged in meliorism, for want of a better phrase. They want to ameliorate the conditions of the poor. They want to make everything more stable and stabilisable, right? That doesn't extend to India or to South Africa, or whether we could just shoot the buggers down.
No, I mean the enforced abolition of the slave trade under the armed power of the Royal Navy, or the broadening out the franchise in England, at least. I suspect some may accuse you of possibly writing out the struggles of slaves and abolitionists or working class Democrats who did pose a serious problem to capitalist accumulation, capitalist order. Surely the victories obviously were not from the good hearts of the ruling class. And I think if we look at the rebellions in Haiti, the revolution in Haiti, the rebellions in '79 in the colonies in Jamaica, Dominica, the Virgin Islands and Barbados and what have you, like, it was a very real challenge to the bourgeoisie and their emerging state and commercial society.
Well, yes and no. I mean, clearly, slavery as an institution was on the rocks. I mean, and in the southern states of the United States, you can see it was on the rocks in the sense of renting out. So if a slave was valuable in the sense that he was a good leather worker or an artisan, in some skilled man in some way, or skilled woman in some way, then he could rent out, or she could rent themselves out. That is, they would go into town, set up a business themselves as if they were free, and then pay their owners rent for themselves. I mean, once that starts to happen, the whole institution, the logic of the institution is beginning to break down. So you get that tension internally, and you also get the tension of the French Revolution completely meeting its Waterloo, actually in Haiti, with Dessalines and Toussaint.
Yes, Haitians marched towards them singing the Marseillaise.
Yeah, and it was the rights of man, all the rest of it. Well, aren't we men? As Sojourner Truth said, "Ain't I a woman?"
Yeah.
So the whole thing was by the end of the 18th century was in crisis. And the interesting thing is that the capitalist class, in terms of accumulation, had no difficulty dealing with the end of it. They paid off the slaves, the slave owners, with vast sums of money in Britain, and capital accumulation went on barreling along just fine and dandy. And in fact, the people in the slave territories lingered in what can only be called serfdom for many decades and even a century longer. And so that was the tragedy of that the emancipation, the struggles for emancipation. Dessalines, in the end, in Haiti, has to create a kind of corvée system of labour, where you could only get food if you'd laboured on the plantations for, there wasn't a possibility of free labour, really. So that even these men like Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines and others were reared up as slaves. They couldn't abolish it themselves effectively. And then, of course, the Americans and the British and so on completely invested in the debt of Haiti and wrecked its possibilities of development for the next 100 years, and it still continues.
Today,
Still continues. So I don't see the overthrow of slavery as being dysfunctional to the development of capitalism. On the contrary,
no, it was the resistance to slavery that was dysfunctional.
Well, the resistance to slavery led to the end of slavery, but it didn't enhance the situation of large numbers of subject peoples greatly. I mean, and that's the tragedy, it seems to me, because sharecropping and so on, all that kind of serfdom that existed, that was reimposed on the American southern states, and the endemic poverty of the Caribbean islands and so on, and the status of black people, for instance, in Brazil, to this day, are all signal evidence of.
Or returning soldiers after the Second World War, striking and rioting in Jamaica, where the Governor General had to call in the troops to put down.
That's right. But these are marginal matters as far as the capitalist class are concerned. It doesn't really interrupt the progress of their enterprise. I think this discussion of the working class as if it's an ahistorical notion, as if it always exists or always existed and continues to exist in the same form is entirely wrong. I think what we tend to call the working class, people who are waged workers, who work for employers, start to become significant towards the end of the 18th century in England. And the brilliant book by E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class, looks at this process of formation and ends in 1832. And so the kind of working class that he sees coming into existence by 1850 has disappeared entirely. Right? The working class was a very different thing between 1832 and 1850. And then between 1850 and 1867, it was different again. The scale of industry was different. The complexity of the management of industrial enterprise.
Well, also the scale of working class organisation. When you get to the point of new unionism at the end of the...
Yes, but of course unions were continued to be illegal until the early 1870s. And so they were always ducking and weaving. But the new unionism was a craft unionism, if I understand it correctly. So highly skilled workers could band together, after the crushing of Chartism from the 1850s, early 1860s, the kind of craft trade unionism.
But it did also involve a mass of industrial workers, chain makers and what have you. So it involved moved away from the elite unions of the working class gone by, or guilds, from even further back to a more industrial scope of organising.
Certainly, but they were skilled craft unions, so they were highly skilled men in all these enterprises. And you're right, the size of the enterprises was growing, but you don't get the unionising of the mass of labourers, of unskilled workmen, until the end of the century, till the 1880s, 1890s. Then the labourers in gasworks, or the women labouring in the match factory, or dock labourers demanding the tanner, the docker's tanner, in 1889. Those kind of struggles are of a different character again, because they are the mass of labouring men, and by and large they're not enfranchised. They don't have the vote, because the section of workers that do have the vote are the better off workers from 1867 onwards. They're the workers who can pay £10 rent a year and demonstrate that they're steady and reliable persons, and they get the vote, right? So there's a tension there within the working class. So what I'm saying is that the working class is constantly changing. So the working class I grew up with and I grew up in began to disappear in the 60s and 70s, much to our dismay. We didn't know what was happening, really. But I can remember arguing in County Hall when I worked there. We were standing in the doorway to the typing pool, and there's all these women sitting in rows behind typewriters. And I said, I was talking to this bloke, and I said, you'd know what was happening if we took all the typewriters off the tables and replaced them with sewing machines. You'd see what was going on then. You'd understand it. But because they're typewriters, you're not quite understanding what's going on. But that working class, a typing pool, people would say, what's one of them? Right, it's disappeared. One thing after another, one technology after another has just disappeared. And the life that went with it has disappeared.
Yeah.
And that's the point I would make, is that so working people work in a different way now, right? And their whole demeanour, that what they think is possible, what they think is suitable, is different from the kind of working class I grew up in, which was very much to do with discipline and sameness, us all sticking together. We were all,
I mean, there is discipline today, but it's a very different kind of discipline.
It's a different kind of discipline.
Or enforced, not through the same ways, through debt, through mortgage payments and what have you.
Exactly. But the point I'm making really is that difference was regarded as dysfunctional in the past, in the working class I grew up in. And this was not just a thing of the capitalists. It was the trade unions didn't like difference. The left didn't like difference. No. We all had to be the same and aspire to the same things.
And you were the first window dresser to be on Bradford's Trades Union Council.
On the trades in Leeds, the Trades
Leeds,
Council in Leeds. That's right. And so these old guys, they were dismayed by a 19-year-old window dresser. What was I doing in the Trades Council? So that kind of disruption really tells you something about the way in which the working class was changing. And of course it became bloody and terrible in the 80s with mounted police riding down coal miners and the battles against the print workers at Wapping and all those struggles, and those struggles of women workers at the photo processing plant in North London. All those situations were absolutely appalling, but they changed the working class. They destroyed the previous kind of working class, and a new working class arose to replace it. And
it was not just new technologies or what have you, it was an attempt to stop the restriction on profit making that the organised working class had. At that time, it was, you talk about closed shops in printing and what have you in your book. And obviously you take on Marx's argument that, the capital constantly remodels the working class on its needs.
Well, yes, I mean, if you look at Wapping, the News International employed something like, I think it was 6,000 odd workers on Fleet Street. Mm-hmm. Once they introduced a new technology in Wapping, they could produce all their titles with 600 workers or something like that. The figures are in the book. But the extraordinary level of savings, it's just extraordinary situation. So workers resisted, as they always have done from the Luddites in the 1800s against the new machinery, all the way down, and have always been defeated. They've always tried to resist what the employers are doing, and in the end get defeated.
We get this story still today, don't we? With self-driving trains or and what have you in terms
Well,
of
if you
trading.
think about dock labour, I mean, all the dockers had strong trade unions and so on, and they were all defeated by containerisation. The introduction of containerisation wiped out the whole life of dockers and the way that dockers lived, and the whole world was gone.
Yeah.
I mean, this was very much discussed in relation to the miners' strike, that communities were destroyed, which is true. A whole way of living, a whole way of going on was gone, right? Who remembers whip walks now? You know, who remembers the whole panoply of working class life now? I mean, I always remember being at the miners' gala when we had miners in Durham, and seeing the embroidered banners of the trade unions and the brass bands marching into the
cathedral.
into the cathedral, the Norman cathedral, and going up the aisle of the Norman cathedral. Just extraordinary, moving scenes, really. Full of contradictions, with Lenin on the banners and Keir Hardie on the same banner, all these different contradictory elements, and often with a working class man in full drag dancing in front of the banner, right? What was going on there, God only knows, but that world is gone. They still have it every year, but it's not the same thing. It's a reenactment society, really.
It's like Tolpord Martyrs Festival, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I see the modern working class as being composed of people who do routine manual or clerical labour, and find themselves actually in many respects in really difficult, straitened circumstances in face of capital that they can't do anything about, because there's no effective trade union, there's no effective modes of resistance.
No effective left, which, I mean...
left, but then you have to ask, well, the effectiveness, the way people deal with it is by changing jobs and by, you know, what the recruitment specialists called churn. You know, so people keep changing jobs, they get promoted, they do other things, they resist in different ways, they push their elbows out in different ways. And consequently, it seems to me that I don't know about I don't know politically how you can talk about the modern working class, but it seems to me the left is talking about the working class I grew up with. They seem to have forgotten. They seem to have missed the intervening 40 years.
Defeat.
Yeah.
I mean,
they seem to have missed it. They seem to have missed it.
I mean, because you spare no punches in terms of attacking the left for not understanding the realities of the day, or not being able to speak to working class life and understanding working class life.
That's right.
And therefore that is why we're so what you say is the left is so distant from the working class, or has any real purchase among workers today. I think that's why we're constantly defeated. I mean, the reason we're constantly defeated is that we don't know very much about capitalism, and we keep trashing the settlements that working people make to try and survive, right? So massive working people do all sorts of things to survive and make their way in the world, and we are constantly superior about it, because we have superior consciousness. We know how capitalism works, as if the workers don't know. Of course, the truth of the matter is every working person knows that how the system works. They don't need to be told. What they need to be told is there a way out? Where's the bloody exit? Right? And that's what we've been conspicuously unsuccessful at depicting. A way forward in which working people could hang their, go with us, go with the left, go with the socialists and the communists and the anarchists, and
fight against capitalism with some idea about what we were going towards, what we were going to replace it with. But nobody has any idea about that. And that's why they don't come with us. They look from the sidelines. Sometimes they support us, sometimes they don't, but they look from the sidelines and they think, this is a rum do, we're not going down there. Because it might be Pol Pot down the end of or Stalin or
Labourism.
Yeah, or whatever.
You know, I mean, less bloody, but well, less bloody at home at least anyway. Yeah. But Labourism, you know, is
so they're not persuaded that we've got a coherent and possible way forward. So I would say that I'm a revolutionary, but a utopian revolutionary, and that is that I'm a utopian because I think the idea of working people running the economy and running their places of work is what communism is. When working people run the places of work and they run the economy, you've got communism. That's what I think it's communist.
So you say a reassertion of the democratic foundations of our movement.
Absolutely.
I think,
and so that once you do that, once you conceive of communism in that way, then you have to see that it's utopian, because the mass of working people show not the slightest interest at the moment in running their own firms or workplaces or running the economy. It doesn't enter their heads, right? And you have to ask, well, why doesn't it enter their heads? It doesn't enter their heads because nobody has suggested a plausible way to bring this about.
I think one criticism that you may find with your book, especially the latter parts, is it possible to accept your assertion that the working class is not necessarily a political force it once was because it's too heterogeneous, or it always has been, and then in a complicated way, it is also socially conservative. It's therefore questions on republicanism, on democracy, like we've already discussed, and sovereignty must always remain in the realm of the tradition and the nation. What is the prospects for the left breaking through that, or for having an argument which is actually interesting, that shows a way forward, and it engages with people where they are today?
Right. I think the mass of working people are conservative in a general sense, with a small c, and they're conservative because they can't see another way forward. So they accept the existing state of affairs, for better or worse. And the only way of shifting them out of that situation is to persuade people to win support for a line of march towards a different state of affairs, a different setup. So if you want to create a situation where working people run things, run their own institutions, run their own workplaces, participate in managing the economy, which is what communism would be, then you need a kind of politics that is about that. A politics that is always aimed at agency, politics that's always aimed at working people taking matters into their own hands in whatever the particular struggle happens to be. And if that's the case, then we cannot afford to be superior or know what to do, right, in relation to the mass of working people. Given our past record of failure, our past tradition, disastrous tradition, I think, then we need to approach the possibility of building a mass movement politically. It's not going to arise just on the basis of the working class. It's going to be a political movement which is clear about the idea of emancipation, freedom of speech, defending the engagement of the mass of the people in determining what happens in the society in which we live. So it's
but also within their own lives as well. I mean,
Yeah.
if you think, you know, the offer of labourism or the offer of state socialism, you know,
it's all about pacifying people.
You know,
yeah.
the constant, the council worker being constantly involved
Yeah.
in where you live, or, you know, how high your hedge can be, and what have you.
I mean, for instance, I was astonished some years ago when there were queues around Bradford and Bingley as the bank was collapsing, that nobody came up with the suggestion that the workers should simply take over Bradford and Bingley.
No.
You know, we need a movement that thinks like that, thinks, oh, I know, well, that's what we should do.
No, when we have this occurrence all the time, you know, when steel mills are, you know, being sold off to different companies all over the world and look like they're going to be closed, you know, the answer, the automatic answer is nationalisation. That's understandable in terms of people wanting to defend their jobs, but it's very, very rare that you find an argument being put forward for, well, that the plants, the tools and everything else should fall to the going concern as of the mill should fall to the workers.
Yeah, and we should think of something, producing something else. We should make windmills or whatever it is. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it would seem to me that the future of the left and the future of communism has got to be the future of enabling the mass of ordinary folk to participate in their own emancipation. And that is just democracy. And so a left that fights shy of freedom of speech, a left that is rotten to the core in relation to these issues, sneers at the idea of free speech as just being a cover for the right, all that kind of thing, is not going to get anywhere, cannot produce anything good, it seems to me. So in that sense, that's why I'm pleased with the book, because it makes it clear why I continue to be a communist, but I'm no longer left-wing, in quotes, because the left wing that we've got is Ersatz left wing. It's a kind of left wing that defends Islamists, defends all kinds of reactionary points of view. You know, and even I hear defending the idea of a radical Roman Catholicism. so you know, a left that's just a fake left, it seems to me. A left that doesn't defend freedom of speech, freedom of association, and so on, as absolutely fundamental founding principles, is not a left that I want anything to do with.
No.